Καλησπέρα. Καλώς ήρθατε στην δεύτερη ενότητα αφιερωμένη στο θέμα πολιτικές ταυτότητες. The discussion today is going to be in English. However, our discussions, our speakers would be able to respond, to take your questions in either language. So I would like to welcome Vasilis Lambropoulos, Peter Bratsis, and Despina Papadimitriou. And since I assume you all hear me, if you don't mind, just sort of like follow a chronological order based on the content of your talks. Again, if you don't mind, if Despina would like to go first, Vasilis second, and Peter third, would you all agree? Despina? Would that be okay? Can you hear us?
Ναι.
Okay.
Μας ψιλοπιέζουν να πάμε φέτος. Είμαστε όλοι, δηλαδή, ένας συνάδελφος μόνο που είχε κάποιον λόγο.
Δεν σε ακούμε πολύ καλά. We can't hear you very well.
Νομίζω κάποια μαθήματα τα κάνει. Όλοι πάμε πια. Έχουνε...
Αμυνών εμβολιασμένοι και προσέχουν.
Μπορείς ξανά να... Δεν σε ακούμε.
Στο σούπερ μάρκετ πάνε όλοι. Να βγουν έξω, βγαίνουν.
Να.
Δεν ακούγεται καλά.
Τώρα, σε εμάς που είμαστε τώρα και μικρότερο πανεπιστήμιο.
Okay, better. Δέσποινα, μας ακούς?
Ναι.
Okay. Δεν ακούγεσαι όμως πολύ καλά και ανησυχώ αν θα ακούσουμε καθαρά την ομιλία σου.
Δέσποινα, εγώ.
Ναι.
Δεν ακούγομαι τώρα.
Εντάξει, τώρα καλύτερα, πολύ καλύτερα. Μια χαρά. Okay.
Εντάξει.
Έχω
κάποιες...
Ρώταγα αν δεν σε πειράζει να ξεκινήσεις εσύ, να συνεχίσει ο Βασίλης και μετά ο Πίτερ.
Δεν ξέρω.
Δέσποινα, μήπως αυτό μπερδέψει τον κόσμο, ο οποίος έχει στο νου του τη σειρά του προγράμματος.
Τέλος πάντων, δεν είναι τόσο σημαντικό. Απλώς επειδή το περιεχόμενο των ομιλιών σας έτσι κάπως χρονολογικά θα έβγαινε πιο... Αλλά δεν έχει τόσο μεγάλη σημασία.
Ας το κάνουμε έτσι.
Δεν έχει πολύ μεγάλη σημασία.
Το ανέφερα.
Δεν πειράζει.
Εγώ δεν έχω κανένα πρόβλημα. Είναι αλήθεια ότι μπορεί κάποιος που θα ήθελε να ακούσει, επί παραδείγματι, τον κύριο Λαμπρόπουλο, να συνδεθεί μετά. Είναι
Ακριβώς.
Αλήθεια ότι...
Ναι, δεν το σκέφτηκα. Okay, so in this case, let's go follow the program. Let me introduce Vasilis Lambropoulos, who will be our first speaker, who is the Cavafy Professor Emeritus of Classical Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan. His main research interests are modern Greek culture, classical reception and the classic, civic ethics and democratic politics, tragedy and the tragic, word poetry and music. His authored books are Literature as National Institution, The Rise of Eurocentrism, and The Tragic Idea. He has co-edited the volumes The Text and Its Margins and 20th Century Literary Theory, and 2 special issues of academic journals on the humanities and social technology, and Ethical Politics in the South Atlantic Quarterly. So he has been publishing papers, essays, articles, reviews, and translations in journals, periodicals, and newspapers, and he has been serving on the editorial board of several international journals. He explores the notion of revolution as hubris in modern tragedy in the site in progress, The Tragedy of a Revolution. That's an online project. And he blogs on music, literature, France, and resistance at Piano Poetry, Pantelis Politics. I will introduce Peter and Despina later on. So, Vasilis, whenever you're ready, we are listening.
All right. Thank you, Despina, for inviting me to this panel. Congratulations to the collective for this Herculean task that has been so successful. And I have 5 pages to read, which I think you will find quite interesting because I'm telling a story or two. In the late 1950s, the Karamanlis government was heavily promoting Greece as a unique tourist destination. As part of the campaign for the branding of cultural heritage, Karamanlis invited the master planner and coordinator of Sound and Light to put together on the Acropolis a dazzling show that would impress the new masses of tourists visiting the country. Sound and Light, Son and Lumiere, was an innovative French spectacle offering history as entertainment, created and installed by the private French company by the same name, Sound and Light, which took home a significant percentage of the profits. First presented in French castles in 1951 to 53, it was then from the late 50s to the first decade of the 21st century exported to Athens and 3 other Greek sites, as well as to numerous popular archaeological destinations in Italy, England, Egypt, India, and the USA. At a time when Greece was fostering European investment to expedite the country's admission to the common market 2 years later in 1961, and France was developing a variety of economic interests in Greece, the Athenian Sound and Light show, the largest and most expensive of its kind, had the support of both governments, the Greek and the French, and became very popular. It ceased to operate in 2000 after 41 years of continuous operation during the tourist season between March and September. The audience of the show sat on the Pnyx Hill, facing the Acropolis, and listened to the archetypal story of the defeat of the barbaric Persians by the glorious Greeks, narrated to the accompaniment of brilliant lights and original music. There was no acting, it was just light and sound. The monuments of the Acropolis were transformed into a transhistorical symbol of beauty and freedom under the prestigious French cultural patronage with a veneer of civilizing mission abroad. The opening ceremony included, in 1959 that is, included official military patronage as well. 21 French warships and 2,500 naval officers, French naval officers, who marched through the streets of Athens to the Pnyx, participated in a display of military might. Presented as a, quote, celebration of Franco-Greek friendship, it was attended by the Greek royal family, Prime Minister Karamanlis, members of the Greek government, and distinguished international guests. Now, the speaker of the solemn occasion was a towering intellectual figure and a great admirer of things Greek, André Malraux, Minister of State with responsibility for cultural affairs. His speech, Homage to Greece, like the narrative of the spectacle, revolved around the basic theme of West freedom culture versus East tyranny barbarism, a topic which, in light of a Spenglerian decline of the West, fascinated Malraux since his first book, The Temptation of the Occident, in 1926. The speech invoked as exemplary Greek figures goddess Athena, who first combined the spear and thought, as well as Aeschylus and Sophocles, who were both artists and Malraux called them combatants. And also the speech challenged, quote, all the Western youth to remember when for the first time man put in the service of the spirit the spears that stopped Xerxes. The Greek right-wing establishment, which had been alarmed by the remarkable rise of the left in the national elections a year earlier, in 1958, barely 9 years after the end of the Civil War, certainly identified Eastern barbarism with a communist threat. The launching of the Southern Light spectacle had behind it half a century of intense French Hellenism. In France, and I'm quoting here Henri Peyret, in France, never, even during the Renaissance, was there such an obsession with the themes of Hellenic mythology or of Platonic imaginative thought, such a sincere and enriching admiration for Greek drama, such an enlightened appreciation of Greek architecture and sculpture as have been witnessed in the last 50 years, from 1900 to 1950. Claudel, Gide, Valéry, Maurras, Giraudoux, Cocteau, Anouilh, Sartre, Molyneux, Thibaudet, Camus are only some of the French thinkers and authors from that period who incorporated Hellenic ideals in their work. As Malraux put it in his speech, quote, "A secret Greece rests in the heart of all the men of the West." But during the late 1950s, the ideal of Hellas was also mobilized to defend the French prestige that had been tarnished by colonial unrest, as international opinion had turned against France's colonial mission in Northern Africa during the Algerian War of Independence, which had started in 1954. And I'm quoting Marlowe here, France's desire to put its official governmental stamp on the Athenian Sound and Light show can perhaps be read as an attempt to bolster international goodwill and improve its image abroad, particularly in terms of its relations in the Mediterranean. The Sound and Light show allowed France to dress itself up in the guise of benevolent cultural patron. This brings us to the colonial uses of Hellas, which is at the center of this symposium. Algeria is a fascinating example of the role that reception of classics can play in colonial cultures. This reception has served different functions, and I'm quoting here Luke Richardson. In the literature of the French Algeria, there was a long tradition of using classical motifs both to justify colonialism and later to integrate the European and non-European populations of Algeria. Propagandistic appropriations of the Greeks and the Romans by Algerian colonialists illustrate how essential the discourse of classicism was to European imperialism. Here we can mention two classical appropriations, Algerianism and Mediterraneanism, which stood in opposition to each other. The school of Algerianism was focusing on Rome, on the Latin world. It sought to promote a Franco-Algerian nationality that was culturally equal to metropolitan France. In time, this identity would also be stressed as culturally superior to the Arab population and was based on the presence of France in Africa as an absolute right founded in pre-existent Roman presence. And people here would point to Roman ruins in Algeria and say, so this is not colonialism, this is Western presence here since antiquity. The school of Mediterraneanism, the other one, confronted Algerianism by presenting the modern Mediterranean as descended from ancient Greece, not Rome. Quote, the Mediterranean acted as a reclamation of classical culture, which was being used elsewhere to justify imperialism and oppression. If Roman Mediterraneanism was military, fascist, and so on, Mediterraneanism was, the assumption was Greek and democratic and egalitarian. But this school too, the Mediterranean one, ignored the Arab and the so-called Berber culture. Both schools used the ancient culture to marginalize the people over whom they ruled in Algeria. We can now place this inauguration, the 1951 inauguration, of this totally ethereal Hellas, all pure sound and light bathing the Acropolis, in a broader context. At a time of diminished cultural prestige and military might, the French culture, industry, and army appealed to Hellas to show that they remained eminent and powerful. They drew lines of connection between themselves and ancient Greece to suggest that, like the Greeks, they too were fighting the barbaric East by trying to quell the Algerian revolt, which threatened the classical values that Malraux called culture and courage. Standing on the side of the ancient assembly on the Pnyx, Malraux, who once had been a critic of French colonial authorities, but as a Gaullist minister, defended the government policy in Algeria and failed to protest the torture of the French army, invoked democracy and declared an unwavering French commitment to Western civilization, symbolized by HELLAS. Now we'll move on to, incidentally, in the year 2004, when just ahead of the, before the Olympic Games, the Greeks decide that it's time to relit the Acropolis. They again go to the French, they go to the person who had organized the Eiffel Tower spectacle, the Millennium spectacle, and ask him to come in 2004, just months before the Olympics, to light again the Acropolis. But we go now to 2017. Almost 60 years since Malraux spoke at the Pnyx, in the very same place, another French politician reiterated the very same commitment during another Western crisis, this time a political as well as spiritual crisis. In September 2017, President Emmanuel Macron, again in the dramatic setting of the Pnyx, gave a major policy speech on the future of Europe, outlining a new vision for the continent. Since Greece was the symbol of the European crisis at that time, he went to Greece to talk about overcoming that crisis. He said, everything that has held us together for decades is coming apart. And he sought to position himself as the leader to fix European Union's crisis of confidence, calling for the shoring up of the shared European values of sovereignty, democracy, and culture. Like Malraux, Macron is also talking European universal cultures. He said, Europe is one of the last havens where we collectively continue to harbor a certain idea of humanity, law, freedom, and justice. We need Europe now more than ever. The world needs Europe, says Macron at the Pnyx. And here is his understanding of Hellas, quoting Macron. Yes, the Acropolis of Athens is a mirror reflecting our European identity. We recognize ourselves. We read our common destiny in this mirror, and this temple was that of the gods from antiquity. But today, the beliefs that created it have vanished, and yet we still have this force in our minds. We can still feel its sacred element. As André Malraux said, this is Macron in 2017, quoting Malraux, there is a hidden Greece that is lying in the hearts of all men and women of the Western world. Thus, Hellas and France remained mutually authenticating. The similarities with the inauguration did not end here and included a strong financial component, as they did back in 1959. Macron flew with a retinue of business people representing more than 40 companies, including 10 CEOs. As France had signaled that it is keen to invest in infrastructure, energy, construction, and the service sector, his visit focused on the sale of state assets launched by the Syriza government of Alexis Tsipras. Malraux is quoted once again by Lina Mendoni, the Greek Minister of Culture in 2020, when the Onassis Foundation is now sponsoring the relighting of the Acropolis, but we'll skip that and we will conclude with this September, only 2 months ago. In September 2021, Malraux was quoted once again, this time by Prime Minister Mitsotakis, who went to the Élysée Palace to sign with Macron the Strategic Partnership Agreement for Cooperation in Defense and Security between Greece and France, whereby Greece once again bought French technology, meaning 6 fighter jets and 3 warships that continue the military patronage of Hellas launched in 1959. Mitsotakis in his speech quoted the by now familiar phrase, "A secret Greece rests in the heart of all the men in the West." And as he put it, quoting Mitsotakis now, quoting Mitsotakis speaking to Macron, civilization could not exist without the foundation set by ancient Greek thought, but civilization could not have grown either without the fertile winds of the French Enlightenment. And I conclude. By looking at the glorification of transhistorical Hellas at the 1959 inauguration of Sound and Light and its subsequent reverberations and refractions, we can see multiple colonial claims on Hellas made on behalf of France, Greece, the Mediterranean, the West, civilization, whiteness, military might, you name it. And yet no one has noticed that there seems to be something that colonialist Hellas cannot silence. It is an Eastern incantation that we hear at the very end of Malraux's speech as he is addressing himself to the lights that are for the first time illuminating the Acropolis, the sound and light lights. And Malraux concludes like this in his, pompous way. "O radiant lights of this night, go and tell the world that Thermopylae is summoning Salamis and will finish its call with the Acropolis, if only we forget them not. And may the world, beneath the Panathenaeans, never lose remembrance of the mighty procession with the dead of olden days and of yesterday, their solemn guard ascending in the night, their soundless message arising, reaching us united for the first time into the most ancient incantation of the East." And Malraux quotes, "And if this is a night of destiny, blessed be the night up until the coming of the new dawn." Where does this mysterious concluding quote come from? Malraux did not give his source, but a Muslim Algerian fighting for his country's destiny would easily recognize it. The quote refers to the night of destiny or power, which to Muslims is the holiest day of the year, when the Holy Book was sent from heaven to the world. If Ernest Renan prayed to God, if Ernest Renan prayed to Goddess Athena, did Malraux pray to Allah? The grave Panathenaean procession ascending the sacred rock through the centuries is sending us its silent message in the language of the oldest Eastern incantation from the Quran. Might these united tidings be the secret Greece that rests in the heart of all the men in the West? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Βασίλη. Ευχαριστούμε. Να συνεχίσουμε με τον Peter Bradzi, ο οποίος είναι who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the City University of New York and has authored and co-authored a couple of different books, Everyday Life and the State, and with recently deceased Stanley Aronovitch, Paradigm Lost, State Theory Reconsidered. He's also the author of a number of articles in peer-reviewed journals, collective volumes, but also newspapers and magazines. His research mainly concerns the categories and ideas that our political world is based upon and how these ideas are created and reproduced. This has included studies on the production of the state, the categories of the public and private, the ways that nationalized individuals are created, and the perception of the clean and dirty in political life. Current projects include a book by the title An Anatomy of Corruption, Nationalist Desire and Imperialist Ideology in the Age of Globalization. Peter, we are listening.
Thank you, Despina. And thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm very happy to be here and to be speaking also on the panel with Vasily and Despina. I'm going to focus on two issues that I think have been particularly relevant to Greece in the context of contemporary imperial or colonial projects. The question of corruption, of course, and the anti-corruption movement that has been in existence from around 1993 onwards, and the question of the increasing disembeddedness or authoritarian character of the capitalist state, and how both have been manifest in Greek politics. To begin with, I think if there is any contemporary imagining of the world that reproduces the traditional colonial viewpoint, it is that of corruption. If you look to the various maps that are produced by Transparency International, by the Opacity Index and a number of other organizations, you will see a map of the world that very, very closely corresponds to the colonial and racist imagining of the world. The southern part of the world, Africa, much of Asia, of course, South America and so forth, is in the darker colors, indicating more corrupt, of course, more corrupt. And the lighter colors, which are in the North America, northern parts of Europe and so forth, are in a very light color. Now, this way of conceiving of the world as more prone to corrupt or less to corrupt has a number of functions. To begin with, it is a way of justifying the relative fortunes of these different regions of the world. That Africa is poor is not to be understood as a product of colonialism, as a product of the world system or any other way. It is to be understood as a self-created and unfortunate situation that the corruption among these peoples have doomed them to a life of poverty and lack of economic development. For example, there's Susan Rose Ackerman, who's a professor at Yale, has written many books on this, has a book precisely on this question. And she asks, you know, how can it be that Africa, that is so wealthy in terms of natural resources, can be so poor? And her conclusion is, well, obviously it's because they are living under these corrupt regimes, which squander wealth, which inhibit economic development and doom them to poverty. It also, of course, functions as a justification for foreign intervention. That because these places are not capable by themselves of securing the conditions for economic development, for securing the conditions for proper governance or an efficient state functioning, there has to be some kind of intervention from the outside, whether that be the World Bank, whether that be the IMF or any other kind of international agency. Now, Greece, of course, has featured prominently in this context because it has been Greece that has been understood as by far the most corrupt of all the countries of the European Union, usually by a very wide difference compared to, let's say, Italy or Portugal, or some of the other, a bit above average in terms of corruption, but not, of course, on the level of Greece. This has functioned. Now this doesn't come from out of nowhere, obviously, because the index on corruption is based on a survey of business people and country experts as to how corrupt they perceive these various places to be. So the index, or the various indices produced on corruption, are a measure of surveys of people who view Greece or Italy or Egypt or China, what have you, how corrupt they might be. And it's not surprising, of course, given this, that Greece consistently ranks as among the most corrupt. These, as I mentioned before, these programs begin in 1993. They have expanded and become more intense since then. And I think in terms of its ideological mission, we have to conclude they have been extremely successful. That it is almost gospel today that economic development follows from or is inhibited by corruption, that high levels of corruption equal low levels of economic development. And if Greece has economic problems, for example, if there is a debt crisis or there are severe economic problems within Greece, it is best understood as a product of their corruption. And of course, George Papandreou said this in very direct ways when he was prime minister. Pangalos, of course, very famously with the phrase that "ta fagame mazi," we all ate it together. You know, that don't blame who you're going to blame yourself, because you know you were the ones, the pigs who ate from the trough of public finance. And the same is true globally. Even, you know, I've been to conferences where you have discussions with these economists and people on the other side, and you point out that the two countries with the highest levels of economic growth in the last 30, 40, 50 years, India and China, are two of the most presumably corrupt countries of the world. So if it is in fact the case that is corruption that creates poverty, how do you explain the immense economic development in China and India? And even such a simple and direct example of how this discourse, how this ideology is limited, is not enough to shake them from their certainty that any lack of development is primarily a product of political corruption. Together with this ideological function of the corruption discourse that, again, reproduces the older discourse on the white man's burden of a kind of racialized hierarchy. But instead of now biology or genetics, it's a question of the different people's tendencies towards corruption. Is also a recasting of what corruption means. Because now, as even the name of these organizations indicate, it becomes mainly about the ability to see, transparency. And whose ability to see? Primarily the ability of investors or transnational capital, we could say, to be able to understand and calculate the various costs and benefits involved in their investments. You know, if you invest in Greece, what are the expected taxes and limitations and regulations one has to deal with? And the idea that any kind of informality, any lack of strict bureaucratic procedures, anything that is unexpected, unpredictable, And in fact, any kind of social embeddedness of political institutions becomes a source of corruption. So in addition to pushing for a certain understanding of the world that sees its various regions and parts as a continuum of propensity towards corruption, and the poor parts being much, the ones that are the most corrupt, and the more wealthy, those that are the least corrupt, it also is an attempt to transform the nation state, the capitalist state, in ways that make it less embedded within the societies in which they find themselves. And I think, again, here, Greece plays a very significant role, because Greece, of course, in particular, has had links in terms of its procedures of political legitimation and reproduction that are oftentimes quite informal and have been extremely embedded within society. Clientelism, of course, most notably. The fact that in Greece, there was this informal system of privileges and favors that were done through these clientelist networks was a significant source of not only party stability and discipline in terms of its supporters, but also was a way for common people to get a piece, let's say, of public wealth, a piece of those resources that could be redistributed towards the bottom. Now, it's not mainly necessarily because of the anti-corruption movement that this system has largely broken down. It's in many ways because of the financial limitations that the Greek state faces, where it's no longer possible to hand out much of what it used to in the form of favors to the patrons of the various political groups. But it points to this tendency of states becoming ever more disembedded from social movements, from society. And it mirrors, of course, the increasing disembeddedness of capital from place. Greece, again, was always a bit out of the norm in terms of Europe, at least, because the main capitalist enterprises in Greece were largely what has been termed by Nikos Pouladras and others, comprador capitalism, which is to say, Greece served as a kind of staging post in the global circuit of capital, but it was not, Greece in itself was not of any great importance. The domestic markets weren't of any great importance. Internal developments weren't of any great consequence. Capital flowed through. So, of course, industries like shipping, tourism, mining, banking, they may have been stationed in Greece in some ways, had some connections to Greece, but the ship owners, and this year, of course, there was the famous incident in the interview with Panos Laskaridis, who said, and I paraphrase, the ship owners shit on the prime minister. We don't need the prime minister. We don't need the Greek state. They need us, which is, of course, not inaccurate. Is unusually honest. So this increase, and this has been true in Greece for a long time, but this has become even more true, of course, in recent times, especially in the context of the debt crisis. So on the one hand, the anti-corruption movements. On the other hand, the already quite weak position Greece was in terms of its position within the global capitalist system, how it had little leverage to gain concessions from capital, to impose some kinds of limitations on the movements of capital, or on the how embedded capital was within Greece, have become even weaker. And one way this is manifest in terms of political developments is that the Greek state becomes ever more rigid, ever more inflexible, and ever more authoritarian. What, again, Pouranzas had termed authoritarian statism. That because of increasing bureaucratic rigidity, because of the financial limitations of contemporary capitalism, where the state is not able to impose great concessions upon capital any longer, because it is so easily moves. It's so easily to overcome any attempt at state regulations, to secure legitimation, since the Greek state can no longer rely primarily upon the clientelist networks, let's say, or other non-coercive forms of legitimation. It becomes more and more and more coercive, both in terms of its market disciplining tactics, its control of public benefits and so forth, and of course directly with the police, as we've seen many times over the last years, including of course very recently in Greece with these acts of police violence. And if there's any job that has grown in the last 10, 12 years since the beginning of the financial crisis, it is the jobs of the riot police, or police more generally in Greece. That's the one area of growth of employment, within a very dire economic situation. And I would say that paradoxically, even though Greece was always in the margins, as it were, of these historical developments within Greece, much of the time, Greece has gone from being in the margins to being a paradigmatic example of how things are going. That the situation in Greece today is closely being matched by the situation today in the United States, in Britain, in France, and other places. The same limitations on the autonomy of the state, the same limitations on the capacity to control and impose some concessions from capital. The same weaknesses are now being seen not only in the margins, but also in the center of the capitalist global system, and certainly it points to a very dire and bleak political situation today. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you. Despina, whenever you're ready, let me say a couple of things about your work. Despina Papadimitriou is an associate professor of history at Pantheon University School of Political Sciences. Her research interests include contemporary Greek and European history, ideological analysis, political conservatism, and the far right, conceptual history as well. She's the author of several articles as well and books, including The Interwar Crisis, the Greek Public Debate, published in 2012. Another one with the title From the Law-Abiding People to the Nation of the National-Minded, The Conservative Thought in Greece, 1922-1967. Another title, Notes on the History of the Press, Greek and European Dimensions, this in collaboration with Aristides Baltas, and another one in collaboration with the Mergis, Karapostolis, Armenakis, by the title Cultural Identity and Mass Media of the Hellenic Diaspora. Despina, we are listening.
Thank you very much, Despina, for the invitation. I'm glad to participate in this panel. You hear me, okay?
That's fine.
What was the relationship between the idea of Greek liberty and the Western dream world in the early Cold War? Greece's manifest destiny entered the new temporal horizon that opened up with the Cold War, reinterpreting the assigned role of Greece in the free world. I'll often use historical concepts, those derived from the text, the language of the contemporaries, that you will understand it. Totalitarianism as a concept and a theory contributes to unifying Western political thinking on democracy and its enemies, the state, the party, and civil society. It differs from vulgar versions of the communist conspiracy theory emerging as a rather sophisticated theoretical approach of political phenomena, fascism, Nazism, communism, having their origins in the First World War and their replication in the mind and soul of the individual. But what really makes the difference is that while the nation as a concept is usually implicated in anti-communist and communist discourses, anti-totalitarian thought goes beyond it, expressing often a universal perspective. In April 1950, Marion Dönhoff, the anti-Nazi journalist and later an outspoken advocate of German reunification, argued for freedom rather than unity. She considered it more opportune for Germans to be content with freedom at that conjuncture and to work for unity later. Furthermore, national hubris was associated to the extreme violence of the Third Reich, which gave a racial definition of national identity. In this vein, the mapping out of the new semantic field in the early Cold War years supports the argument that a global approach is more than a matter of the researcher's choice. It is imposed by historical actors' connection to wider ideas, values, and a consciousness of belonging to a global community. The post-war period was also characterized by reassuring belief in the future as the space of hopes and fear, and as Anderson puts it, the idea of a future linked to the idea of humanity as joined together by common destiny. Constellations of friend and foe constituted against the historical horizon of the Second World War were reconfigured by new categories, such as the totalitarian enemy. Greeks who believed in this anti-totalitarian loyalty, the national-minded Greeks, looked back to the past not to select heroic moments, but to identify the itineraries the nation had recently followed in its 9-year struggle, I quote, against the forces of aggression and violence, the Black and the Red Menace. Western European governments in Washington shared their interest in securing Europe against Soviet expansionism towards Europe and Asia, as seen by many Western leaders. They detected a world confrontation of two alternative ways of life in which freedom was everywhere imperiled, as codified in Truman's speech. In another speech, Truman declared, many of these people are confronted with a choice between totalitarianism and democracy. This decision has been forced upon them by the devastation of war, which has so impoverished them that they are easy targets for external pressures and alien ideologies. In fact, concerns over post-war development in Greece were associated with the regional strategy for Western Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Near East. In 1946, the United Nations Security Council rejected Soviet charges against the British military presence in Greece and the Greek government's policies for endangering peace in the region. In October 1947, United States brought the Greek question before the General Assembly of the United Nations. A special committee on the Balkans was established to investigate the circumstances relating to the Greek Civil War. According to the resolution 193, the continued aid, I quote, given by Albania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia to the Greek guerrillas endangered the peace in the Balkans and was inconsistent with the purpose and principle of the Charter of the United Nations. Greek MP Panagiotis Kanelopoulos, ex-Minister of National Defense, in his speech in the plenary session of the United Nations in September 1950, used the concept of totalitarianism. He portrayed Greece as a victorious democracy, which after a hard struggle of 10 years against totalitarianism of every kind and color, has entered into a period of peace and of complete normality and reconstruction. He also raised the issue of the Greek children, I quote, forcibly abducted from their homes and still undergoing the inhuman totalitarian distortion of their soul and spirit. In this context, he linked the supposed de-Hellenization of the evacuated children from their homes in northern Greece to the theme of totalitarian indoctrination. The fears expressed that the children relocated to the countries of the Eastern Bloc would turn to foes of their families, evoke the image of the recruitment of Christian-born children during the Ottoman rule in Greece. Another, among the most influential notions in the conceptual articulation of totalitarianism was that of the captive mind, which entered the semasiological field of the West with Miloš's book published 2 years after his defection to the West from Poland in 1951. Miloš explicitly emphasized the fact that those who felt attracted by the new faith paid their debt to the old European tradition, exemplified in the wars of religion. It was something more than constrained by material force. Tony Judd wrote that the captive mind is memorable for the pill of multi-being image which Miloš reproduced from an obscure novel by Stanislav Ignacy-Witkiewicz, Insatiability of 1927. In this story, Central Europeans encountering the invasion of unidentified Asiatic hordes swallowed a little pill which relieved them from fear and anxiety, but also made them accept their new rulers, making them happy to receive them. The iconography was a classic metaphor of intellectual enslavement. The Greek liberal novelist Angelos Terzakis discusses the mind of the crown under dictatorship using similar notions, such as that of the expropriated mind. For him, the situations faced by thinking people in France are the same as those faced by those worried about the present and the future in Greece. In his effort to conceptualize the global conscience, he argued that the era of isolationism was over. Issues are therefore global. Without being an essentialist, anyone would agree with Sartre, he said, that a man is a whole world, whether he lives in Paris, in Potsdam, or Vladivostok. Let me move on because the time passes. While cultural categories featured among the most popular themes of Orthodox Christianity, the Orthodox Church's discourse shared the conventions of Western ideology that regarded communism as advocating atheism, the abolition of faith, religion, and family values, recurring themes since the anti-Bolshevism of the 20s. Gratitude was expressed to the great and noble American nation for his assistance in the war against the forces of darkness and on behalf of the preservation of the liberties of the world and Christian civilization. In the synodical admonition against the Banted War, that was the official term to describe the Greek Civil War from 1946 to 1949, the Church of Greece, using the official language of a non-ideological discourse production, posed the risk of an alienation of the people from its spiritual heritage and long-term traditions, as well as of the eradication of the national body. I have to move on again. And I'll talk about the evocation of the classical past as a cultural commonality. It's the last part. Though the image of the Hellenes as the founders of Western civilization derives from another older experience, its articulation in the new space of experience opened up by the Cold War was of crucial importance for the elaboration of the discourse of the nationally minded Greeks and anti-totalitarian discourse in general. For Constantine Tsatsos, Greece was assigned a specific and unique cultural mission, that is, the transmission of Greek liberty. Writing after the Battle of Athens, the Kembriana, in December 1944, he used the ancient Greek concept of hubris as synonymous with the violation of the law of measure, which places limits on all human action. Hubris, symmetry, and measure are antithetical to extremism and violence, immanent to the mystical dogmatism of the communists. Transhistorical ideas of Hellenicity as a cultural value and cradle of Western civilization were reappropriated in the context of the Cold War. Drawing on Karner analysis of the palimpsests of the Romantic, I propose that all sentimental encounters with and scholarly investigation of Greek antiquity were rewritten under specific international conditions. The rewriting of Hellenicity puts Greece among the nations to whom a preeminent role was attributed in the so-called Battle of the West against Asian despotism. Beyond the reference to cultural values derived from classical antiquity, political nationalism was transposed into the international system. The Greeks could turn their historical experience, their lived or imagined past and present, into a political reality that also concerned other Western nations. The ideological boundaries of the West at that time were delineated by the lines that separated Soviet culture from, I quote, the idea transmitted from the Greco-Roman tradition and that of the Renaissance. The idea of Greek liberty prevails not only as a long-term structure, but also as a political issue regarding Greece's territorial integrity as a question of security for the Western nations. And I conclude, all in all, moving beyond an approach centered on national history, foreign intervention in Greece, or on post-war exceptional anti-communist politics, I try to argue for an interplay of all historic actors, big and small nations, US and Greece, in the elaboration of anti-totalitarian discourse and the ideological polarization. It was not only the American manifest destiny, but also Greek mission to fight communist barbarism in favor of the Western ideals of liberty and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Despina. Thank you all for your talks. We have about 15 minutes for a discussion. I have a couple of some questions, comments, and feel free to comment on each other's papers, of course, ideas. I will communicate any questions if they come from our audience here or the audience online. So the way I understand, basically, you're from the outset maybe appearing as sort of like different approaches to the discussion here. I would sum it up as saying that, as I understand, Despina, basically explaining the role of Greece, or here like Hellenism in this new free world following World War II. Basically, Greece as carrying the torch of anti-totalitarianism, a concept that sort of goes beyond like anti-communism, has like a universalized but also universalizing take on that. And explaining the meeting of nationalist, prior nationalist conservative thought with post-war, again, anti-communism, and Greece sort of serving the new needs of political needs and political dispositions of the West. Then Vasilis' take on Hellenism appears to be sort of another way to used here as a pool of Siloam, in a way, where colonial crimes, such as that of the French army against the Algerian resistance, were washed off, or new business deals, such as that described being brought by Macron, sort of like put in against a symbolic context here of that of Hellenism as well. And of course, Peter's paper, which in his title basically suggests that Greece here being used not as a way of legitimizing the civilizing Western mission prior or after World War II, but sort of functioning as a canary in the mine, being here a paradigm, what you call a concrete universal, describing the Greek crisis and basically sort of like foretelling or announcing what is about to come. I would have another number of questions. Maybe I would start with Vasilis and ask. I mean, as I was reading your paper and like listening to you today, I was thinking about the latest Obama's highly publicized visit of Obama here in Greece after his second term, where he made sure that he was photographed against the backdrop of Acropolis and other side as well. And I wonder, of course, that was at the time that pretty much he wanted to solidify this transatlantic relationship. He made explicit references to NATO. I wonder about the power of those symbolic gestures. I mean, anybody would assume or could say, like, yes, fine. I mean, if you want to discuss or talk about democracy or whatever, it's the most natural or expected thing to do it, like with the Acropolis as a backdrop. But where do you see, or where could we seek like a power of symbolic gestures as such? Do they matter really? Are they as important as maybe some of us think they are? Vasily, if you would like to start the discussion, and I can follow up with more questions. We can hear you.
Appearing before with the Acropolis as appearing on the physical space of the Athenian assembly with the Acropolis as backdrop in the 50s was still powerful. And that's why I mentioned also the first half of the 20th century with the incredible French Hellenophilia. Now, with the passing of time, with the colonial and what used to be called third world movements becoming more important, more influential, changing the terms of the discussion, all the way to the present, to current critiques of the classical and the associations of the classical with colonialism, with Eurocentrism, with patriarchy, and so on. We have a very interesting, say in the second half of the 20th century, if we can put it this way, change of direction, change of vocabulary, change of values, whereby the classical connotations can be negative, can be self-undermining. And then given the situation that, and this is where Despina's and my presentations converged, and then given the latest experiments with Greece that Peter described, we have an entirely new situation whereby the classical does not have the cultural or financial or political prestige that it used to.
So you would argue that its effectiveness is waning away?
Radically diminished.
I can bring up like more examples. I'm thinking, for instance, about the Democracy Forum, this new institution sort of organizing annual conferences. New York Times is behind it. A number of liberal institutions, international liberal institutions, which, and this goes the direction that you just suggested, invited ultra-conservative like people such as Bannon recently, and made sure, of course, that photographed against the expected background of Acropolis. The whole thing took place in the Agora, ancient Agora. I don't know, I mean, I don't know if anyone would like to add to that. I would think that despite like the possible negative connotations, still like quite evocative. And your argument about Macron, it seems that makes more palatable like economic deals such as the one he brought at the time in Greece. But it's an interesting argument, yes, to make that for some audiences at least, this might also have like negative connotations.
Then you have the entire, if I may, Despina, then you have the entire very different reconfiguration of the Hellenic in, for example, the performances of ancient tragedy over the last several years, where staging Medea or Antigone or Phaedra and so on has become very counter-classical, if I can put it this way, in that the protagonists are no longer white or straight or European, and where the tragic dilemmas are staged in very different terms. So a classical realm or body of knowledge and performance like tragedy has been very successfully and very inspiringly reclaimed by other approaches that have nothing to do with the world of Malraux and Macron and Mitsotakis.
Yes, that brings me to the final question, which I will save for 2 minutes later. I would like also to ask whether you think that following this consolidation of liberalism, at the heart of which this discussion about corruption, of course, lies, that Peter introduced in Greece, and more recently, it's neoliberal sensibilities, reaching the point where healthcare is equated with totalitarianism, as Zizek explains, and Peter also mentioned at some point in his paper. Can we talk about a new colonial claims on Hellas? This could be a question for anyone, but if you want Despina or Peter or... Greece most recently has been described as a dead colony. Is this a useful analytical category, or can we stay within an analysis of neoliberalism, imperialism? How would you address the recent development?
I think it's useful on the level of ideology. You know, I think one thing that I'm trying to emphasize is that we, or at least many of us, have indeed accepted the colonial viewpoint that the Greeks have a propensity towards corruption, or they are responsible for the economic problems, sovereign debt, and so forth, that is currently the situation, you know, within the country. So I think there has been very successful. We can talk about a neo-colonial or a new version of the colonial viewpoint, that there are superior and inferior cultures or moralistic tendencies within the world. At the same time, I think it's very misleading to see Greece as a debt colony, or as a colony in the traditional sense, because to the degree that capital has become so transnational, you know, so much occupying the in-between spaces of nation states, that you cannot really point to the poverty, the debt of Greece, and show the wealth of some other part of the world, let's say. That the indebtedness of Greece directly translates into the prosperity of Sweden or Norway or Britain or France and so forth. I mean, in fact, many of these countries also face, to a lesser degree, of course, a problem of sovereign debt or an inability to increase sovereign revenues in order to pay for various social projects. I mean, look to the current situation in the United States, where there was the so-called 3.5 trillion proposed spending plan by Joe Biden and his peoples, which was denounced as very extreme, you know, a very high level of spending. whereas in fact, it would have been about 1.5% of GDP. A very small number, 1.5% of GDP now appears as if it were a huge program. If I remember well from George Bataille, where he talks about the building of the Acropolis was something like 3 or 4 years of GDP of Athens at that time. And now we have 1.5% of GDP, which is, of course, you know, an unthinkably crazy number to, and in part it is, of course, true because the state is very limited in its capacity to tax and raise revenue on capital. But I think for us at least, you know, an important question has to be how to decolonize our perception of Greece and of Greekishness today, so we don't reproduce these colonial viewpoints of propensity towards corruption being that which causes these inequalities. It is very widespread.
Sorry, Peter. Okay, excellent. Yes, this idea about not actually being understood as dead colony is something one could discuss further. It's quite interesting. Despina, anything else you would like to add to this?
Excuse me, Despina, I cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry.
I wonder if Vasilis Orakis could repeat for me
yes,
your question.
Following
Excuse
like
me, I don't know, only you, I cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you cannot
hear me? No,
it's
not your problem. I don't know, perhaps my internet, I don't know.
Can't hear me at all? Like, I don't know, maybe, okay, Vasily, if you would like to, or Peter, if you would like to repeat the question. I was asking whether there's, following this consolidation of liberalism in Greece and more recently like neoliberal sensibilities, if we can actually talk about new colonial claims on Hellas, or is this a useful analytical category? Should we move towards other ways of trying to understand the situation? No?
Despina,
thank you, Vasilis.
Despina Papadimitriou, did you hear the question?
Not exactly. Could you repeat it for me? About something about colonialism, but could you repeat it for me?
Maybe, Despina Papadimitriou,
or
maybe
can
you have a concluding. Maybe you have a concluding comment or remark to make, since we are running out of time.
Right, we're running out of time. Or maybe I can ask like or something like to think about in the future, where there are any emancipatory possibilities still in this rather conservative term or idea of what we call Hellenism. And here I wanted, of course, to refer to the recent economic crisis and the political developments that came out of it. So if you have any quick comment on that, and we can wrap it up or think about it later.
This is for Peter.
Anyone, but
okay,
and I hope
this is for Peter.
Okay.
If I'm supposed to answer, or Peter?
Or if you can hear us, like, yes, we would be happy to hear from you.
I cannot hear you very well.
Sorry, let's
have Peter giving the answer. Okay.
Sorry.
What was the question again?
Whether there are any emancipatory possibilities, sort of reappropriating this idea of Hellas, Hellenism, or what Greece is. I mean, we came at the verge of like changing the world according to some people's expectations, like a few years ago.
No, I think in Greece the political situation is over. I mean, the failures of Syriza have eliminated, I think, we cannot predict the future.
Right.
You know, this is impossible. But at the present moment, there is no movement of any significance, left movement of significance within Greece. I think this is not. And of course, some notion of Hellas is, I think, also completely untenable as a revolutionary project. Of course, there are ideas. You know, there are germs, as Castoriadis used to say, you know, to help us to think about some of these things. But I don't think it's possible or productive or desirable to create a left a revolutionary project in the name of Hellenism, or in some new version of these ideas.
Okay. Should we leave with that rather negative note, Peter? Okay, thank you all for your... Or Vasily, you have something to add?
No, I...
Yes.
It is as Peter says right now, you cannot work whether within the Greek environment or maybe within the broader humanistic environment. It's very hard to do something emancipatory with Hellenism. At the same time, with the exhaustion of the revolutionary project, it's very hard to think in emancipatory terms anyway, Hellenic or any other. So this is the challenge of our destitute times, to see what can be done with either by, as Brecht would say, refunctioning a repertoire of older terms in a radical way, or simply coming up with a new repertoire.
Right. Thank you all very much, and I hope we have a chance to continue our discussion either within Decolonize Hellas or other venues. Thank you all.
Thank you, Despina. Thank you.
Thank you, Despina. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Vasily, for all this.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to yet another panel of Decolonize Hellas Symposium, the first symposium, nomadic and hybrid. I'm Nicholas Kosmatopoulos. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology and politics in the American University of Beirut. And I'm sitting here alone, but hopefully I'm not going to be alone too long. I'm waiting to welcome our guests today on the panel called From Merchants to Tycoons, the Greek Shipping Industry in Ottomanism, Colonialism, and Capitalism. This is a panel that aims to just scratch the surface of a very huge discussion about the place of Greek shipping merchants today. But we are very lucky to have perhaps the most suitable and the most well-placed researchers to do this scratching. I'm saying scratching because the theme is necessarily vast as the sea itself. It's very difficult to even claim that we can scratch more than the surface today, but we will try to discuss with three acclaimed historians, one more acclaimed than the other, about the place of colonialism and decolonialism in the study of the sea, and especially the historical study of the Mediterranean, focus on Greek shippers and shipping magnates. I had the honor to organize this panel. I'm very much interested in the politics of the sea. I realized while studying the topic that one cannot understand much about the sea today if one doesn't look in the past. And the past has very much given me a lot of chance looking at the past of maritime capitalism. Has given me a lot of chance to encounter the work of our guests today. The panel is an ambitious one. in the sense that we have declared the aim to discuss Greek shipping through a macro-historical view, if you wish, over several centuries. But at the same time, I think this is actually a justified ambition because there are more and more research, there's more research coming out that takes this macro-historical view. There is, of course, research that refers to the development and the beginning of capitalism at sea. There is a lot of interesting research on the macroeconomic contours of merchant colonialism, circulational colonialism, as they call it, and then we move on to more recent work on capitalism in the post-world era. Critical logistics is also a very important work. We also talked in the panel that we had this morning about laboring in the sea, at sea, with anthropologists and other researchers about the question of labor and how one approaches labor at sea. One of the discussion points that came out was that methodologically speaking, it is a kind of black hole. It is becoming extremely difficult to do research on this topic, not just because the sea is far away from the land, and people tend to forget that there are many things happening out there that are very important with things happening here, that the sea is becoming extremely relevant to trade. I mean, that has always been the case, but today, even more so. More than 80% of today's merchandise moves through the sea. The sea is also very important gradually in discussions about the environment, climate change. The seas are rising, and that's a very, very concerning phenomenon. But generally speaking, the seas has also very much been always at the center of great developments in the macro-historical sense. That's why we decided to open the frame as broad as we can, and we tackle the place of Greek shipping in Ottomanism, colonialism, and capitalism. Again, this sounds extremely like a hubris. Theoretically speaking, one cannot even claim to cover this vast amount of time and space in these three systems. But we try to do what we do with other panels in this conference, just scratch the surface, place out a promise, and then hopefully live up to the promise in a second and a third iteration of the same discussions. So I'm very happy today to have with me, not here, that's sad that I don't have them here, but online, joining me from, I think, the East Coast of the United States of America, Molly Green. Hello, Molly. Welcome. Nice to see you over the screen. And I will present also Molly Green after I see everybody else, or maybe I should just present Molly first and then move to the second presenter, or can we actually have them all together showing? So I think it's more decent to... Μπορούμε να τους βάλουμε όλους μαζί σε μία οθόνη. Γίνεται.
Η φωνή μπορούμε να ανοίξουμε
Jelena
παραπάνω.
also. Very happy to see Jelena.
Παραπάνω, δεν σε ακούμε πολύ μακρινά.
I cannot really scream. I'm not supposed to. Δεν με ακούει, λέει. Δεν ξέρω γιατί.
Σε ακούμε, αλλά σε ακούμε πολύ μακρινά.
Μακρινά. Μας χωρίζει ένα Αιγαίο. Τι να πει και η Μόλι δηλαδή.
Μας χωρίζει, είμαι στο Βερολίνο αυτή τη στιγμή, σήμερα.
Μας χωρίζουν οι Άλπεις. Οπότε όλα εξηγούνται. Jelena, we are very happy to have you on board. And this is a wonderful background also. Yours also, it's a beautiful background. And I think I'm going to be asking if we can also have Sakis Gekas, the third participant today. Is he? Hi Sakis.
Hello. Yes.
Welcome. So nice to have you on board. And thank you for accepting our invitation. So I'll say a few words about the speakers. Sakis is also kind of a speaker today, but he's mostly, I guess, having two hats, coordinating, and also he has also many things to say about the topic. But I will start with Molly. Molly Green studies the history of Mediterranean basin, the Ottoman Empire and the Greek world. Her interests include the social and economic history of the Ottoman Empire, the experience of Greeks under the Ottoman rule, and the early modern Mediterranean. Her first book, A Shared World, Christians and Muslims in the Early Modern Mediterranean, came out in 2000, examines the transition from Venetian to Ottoman rule on the island of Crete, which the Ottomans conquered in 1669, challenging the assumption of a radical rupture with the arrival of the Ottomans. Green shows that the population of Crete had been drawn into the Ottoman world long before the conquest, and that important continuities link the Venetian and the Ottoman periods. Her second book, Catholic Pirates and Greek Merchants, A Maritime History of the Mediterranean, 1450 to 1700, was published in 2010, and was a co-winner of the, something happened, of the Runciman Award for that year. At the center of the book is the relationship between Catholic piracy and Greek commerce in the early modern Mediterranean. She has a third book published in 2015, the Edinburgh History of the Greeks, the Ottoman Empire, between 1453 and 1768, also shortlisted for the Runciman Award. Jelena Halaftis is a historian. She's a director of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies of the Foundation of Research and Technology since 2017, a professor of maritime history in the Department of History at the Ionian University. She has graduated from the University of Athens and has completed her graduate studies in the Universities of Cambridge and Oxford. She was president of the International Maritime Economic History Association and a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and a visiting scholar in Harvard Business School. She was also a visiting professor in the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, and research fellow in the Greenwich University in London. Her research interests are in maritime history, economic and social history, business history, global history, and diaspora history. He has published more than 25 books in English, Canadian and Greek publishing houses also, and many articles on the maritime history. So Sakis Gekas is an associate professor and the Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair in Modern Greek History at York University in Toronto. He has written on the Ionian Islands under British rule. His latest book, Xenocracy, Economy, Society and State in the Ionian Islands, came out in 2017. Has written also, the book has been also published in Greek recently, Xenocratia, Οικονομία, Κοινωνία και Κράτος στα Επτάνησα. He has also written another book on Δαμασκηνιά, Βιντελούτσι, ένα χωριό στο χώρο και στο χρόνο. So welcome everyone, and thank you for everyone who's here in Botanikos. Without further ado, I'm going to open the discussion. We decided, I think, with Sakis to have a kind of a more of a dialogical form in this discussion rather than papers. So I'll give the floor to Sakis to start off the conversation and welcome you all here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Nicola, Jelena, Molly, I think as we discussed earlier before going online, perhaps Jelena could start first and have some sort of broader comments. She's the really expert on the history of shipping and maritime history, which I think will set the ground quite nicely for the discussion.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and hi, Nicholas. Hello to everybody in Botanikos, and I wish I was there. I'm very happy to be in this panel. Yes, it is not a paper, and certainly I'm not going to send you to tell you 30 years of research about Greek shipping. But I'm going to say a few things and then put down some thoughts as historians, as a historian about what I understand or not understand or doubt about decolonized Hellas. So Greeks as Ottoman and Venetian subjects during the early modern period, and very distinctively since the 18th century, were the main seafarers, ship owners, seamen of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, connecting East and West. And this has been their position for centuries. Somewhere, they were always somewhere between West and the rest, to use the more modern, let's see, one of the main issues of in post-colonialism, or way to say Western Europe and the West and the developing or underdeveloped world. The Greeks continued from the 18th century, continued in the 19th century, based on Greek islands of the Aegean and Ionian Seas under any state, and on the one side, and on the diaspora merchant communities on the other side. These were the so-called merchant colonies, or eborikes parikias. And they formed a system. They formed a system by which the shipping companies of the islands, of 40 islands, of the 120 inhabited, provided transport, low-cost transport services by bringing cargoes that the big diaspora merchants of the Black Sea provided to the West. And this culminated during the era of Industrial Revolution, and they brought grain mainly to the industrialized Europe. So they formed a very large merchant fleet, which was already very big, about 1,000 sailing ships on the eve of the Greek Revolution. And this was their wealth. And their connections as well with the merchant colonies of Greeks from Odessa to Amsterdam. Greek merchant ships became parts of them became the Greek Navy during the Greek Revolution, and the largest part also continued in privateering and in merchanting during the Greek Revolution. After the Greek Revolution, it was still the ships and these maritime centers, the islands that provided, that were still flourishing, continuing to trade in the between the Western Mediterranean, between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean. So by the beginning of the 20th century, by the eve of the First World War, the small Greek state had the 9th merchant fleet in the world. And then in about 50 or 60 years, by the 1970s, Greeks owned the biggest merchant fleet in the world. And they do so in the last 50 years. Okay, they have the largest fleets, more than the United States, the Germans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and so on. So the Greek case and its relation of the businessman to the sea is rather peculiar. Usually a big colonial power is a maritime power. We are not a colonial power, but we are a maritime power. And how is that? And then you go back and you think Greeks were colonized by the Ottomans. They revolted to decolonize themselves. They became a weak peripheral country that gradually took its place to the West by making as well this big merchant fleet, but also its economy. So where is Greece? Okay. Again, I find it between the West and the rest. The title of this conference, Decolonize, Alas, is provocative. And to my most probably traditional historical training, can be insulting. Maybe because I do not understand what it means, or I'll try to understand by reading postcolonialism, because it indicates on the one hand a lack of historical perspective, I find. Modern Greece, despite its glorious past, was on the margins of the West until the last third of the 20th century. And it is since the 1980s that we finally have had an a greater economic achievement to be part of the group of developed countries. Until then, until the 1980s, it was always felt that it was not in the West. There are still Greeks that think we do not belong in Europe. It's because they think it's Western Europe, and we're not Western Europe. We're not West. My generation, I was born in the 1950s, is probably the last that was brought up to be ashamed of our Oriental past, okay? I was brought up to be ashamed of this traditional culture, you know, the Amanes, the Rebetica, the whatever. And it was at Cambridge and Oxford that I got into terms with that. So this is where I became proud of the tradition of my country, but it was also in Greece that things were moving in a different direction. So decolonize, alas. Why is it post-colonialism relevant today in alas? Do we have a colonial attitude? According to Robert Young, and I quote here, post-colonialism claims the rights of people on this earth to the same material and cultural well-being. The reality, though, is that the world today is a world of inequality, and much of the difference falls across the broad division between people of the West and those of the non-West. But this is exactly the same Marxist ideology of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s of my youth and my studies. You know, Immanuel Wallerstein, Center Periphery, Gunther Frank, developed, underdeveloped, first, second, third world, okay? The Marxist socialist vision of the equality of the people, is post-colonialism in a way. It's άλλαξε ο Μανολιός και έβαλε τα ρούχα του αλλιώς. I won't translate this. Are we to call again Greek merchants and ship owners of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, as Poulandzas and Mouzelis called them, agents of capitalism, Trojan horses of imperialism that westernized and colonized Greeks? So decolonize, alas? Maybe you're right, on the other hand. We do need to rethink. We have become West. We have forgotten the 1.5 million refugees of 1922, or the fact that Greek immigrants in the United States or Canada or Australia were second-class people. okay? And they were regarded as we today in Greece regard Somalis, Afghans, Pakistanis, or Syrian refugees. So if decolonize HELLAS means to elaborate in the subaltern, subordinated classes and peoples to remember the other, then yes, I think we need it. The fact is that we became part of the West largely because of the sea in the modern era. So this is just a few thoughts that I just wanted to share with you, and we can go on. I will talk a little bit later about maritime history. With Nicholas, we had discussed how much, to what extent does we can talk about a post-colonial turn in the maritime history. Now, I think maritime history can go well with post-colonial history, with post-colonialism, from the point of view that when you talk about history of the sea, okay, you do not talk about a history of states. You have the sea in the middle. So you talk about the European coast, you talk about the African coast, you talk about the Asian coast. So we have in maritime history, we have the uses of the sea, and we can, and these tools can be combined well with a different view or be, yes. So when in the maritime history, you have the unit in the middle, you have the sea to study, and you study on the sea, navigation, ships, voyages, war, piracy. In the sea, about the sources of the sea, around the sea, maritime communities, port cities, and so on. Because of the sea, there you have the colonial powers, but also maritime transport systems and so on, and inspiration from the sea. So in literature, art, music, and so on. So I will stop here because I put many things in the basket, and we can open up the discussion on these issues.
Thank you very much, Jelena. I think this is quite a lot and it's very, very stimulating. Molly, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to be here and to be on such a distinguished panel. Yeah, I was worried that I wouldn't have much to say, but listening to Jelena, I'm going to try and Professor Halafdis, I'm going to try and be brief. Let's take about the big issue of West versus East, which of course is vital to any project of decolonization. I'm hoping, I'm not very hopeful, but I'm hoping that our current pretty terrible moment at least might have the benefit of finally tearing down this long-standing binary of West versus East. And I don't mean in the old Marxist sense of, you know, all the peoples of the world are united, because they certainly aren't. But when you have in the United States American politicians who on the right, who admire Viktor Orban in Hungary, when you have American politicians who are more sympathetic to Russia than they are to, say, France. All of these, and the populism across the globe, when you have the travesty of the refugee situation in Europe, and sort of all of this discussion of Western values rings more and more hollow. I'm hoping that this idea of something, you know, called the West, which is distinct from the East, you know, might finally break down. And I think for a long time, the idea of the West has continued to be very powerful despite the reality of the West, right? We know that in the 1920s, Ataturk ushered in co-education in Turkey, the new state of Turkey, because that was what it meant to be modern and to be Western. Whereas the university I teach at, Princeton, did not admit women until 1969. Okay, so there's this idea of the West that's not the reality of the West. Okay, that's on big stuff. Professor Harlapis talked about the fact that when you talk about the sea, you do not talk about the state. Here, I just want to give a few perspectives from those of us who are more familiar with trends in pre-modern Mediterranean history and in Ottoman history. So when you talk about the sea, you do not talk about the state. That is absolutely the impetus behind really the soaring interest in Mediterranean history. It's an attempt to get away, not so much from colonialism and capitalism, which are not terms used a lot right now in Mediterranean studies, but to get away from Eurocentrism. And to open up a space, the Mediterranean, that isn't dominated by Europe. This has proved hard to do in practice. At conferences on the Mediterranean, people from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, are routinely absent. Sometimes they can't get visas to come to conferences, so that tells you something. And I think there are these endless discussions, which I think have kind of run their course of whether the Mediterranean is a proper object of study, and what is the Mediterranean and how far does it extend and so forth. And is the Mediterranean itself a colonial term, right? Because the people in the Arab Mediterranean world, the Ottoman world, did not use the term Mediterranean until the 19th century. This is very much a sort of a Greco-Roman term. To this day, there still is not a single journal in the Arabic language, with the word Mediterranean in its focus. So there's lots and lots of discussions about whether the Mediterranean itself, the word, is a colonial imposition. Let me see. Other things that I could talk about. In Ottoman studies is kind of going in the different, so I talked about Mediterranean studies, which very much is interested in the sea, not just for itself, but as a way of getting away from Eurocentric categories. Ottomanists have gone in a rather different direction, and that is because historically the historiographical conclusion has been that the Ottomans were absent from the sea, right? And this goes from sort of close to racist characterizations that the Turks were a people of the steppe and could not, could never adapt themselves to the sea, to more sort of limited and empirical observations, such as the undoubted decline of the Ottoman Navy after the 16th century. I remember when I was in graduate school, Charles Issaoui's Economic History of the Middle East said, from the Crusades on, the Mediterranean became a Christian sea. So Ottomanists have actually kind of trying to bring the state back in comparison to Mediterranean studies. And I'm thinking of work by Joshua White or by Michael Talbot that says, yes, the Ottomans were not able sort of to put forth a navy from the 17th century on to provide security. But they were relevant and they responded to piracy, to violence. And we know this because many petitioners turned to the Ottoman courts for relief. They mounted a legal response, and Michael Talbot has shown that during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, which is often just told as a story of sort of the blooming of Greek shipping as a neutral force, that in fact the French routinely went to the Ottoman port in Istanbul to complain about British attacks on their shipping. And the Ottomans put pressure on the British, and the British had to compensate the French. So there is sort of that is the trend in Ottoman maritime history writing. The other trend in Ottoman history writing is, and I'd be very interested to speak with Professor Harlapis more about this, is to really push against the idea of 1830 being the beginning of modern Greek history, and we're not going to hear anything more about the Ottomans. Professor Harlapis spoke about the term diaspora. I don't know if I would use that term because it implies that the new state, which was small and quite weak, is the natural center. there was a lot of Greek emigration to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, okay? Both by Greeks who were based in Greece and by Ottoman Greeks who went to Greece and got a passport and went back, right? Which gave them incredible advantages. In fact, Berke Torurlu at Bilkent University has made a very persuasive argument, which will be coming out soon. I think he already had an article in the Journal of Modern Greek Studies saying that I forget what the Ottomans called them, but the alienated Greeks, right? Greeks who, as far as the Ottomans were concerned, were really Ottomans, but had a Greek passport, were so many that it was actually the Greeks that kicked off the whole Ottoman project of Ottomanism, of sort of trying to define who an Ottoman was. And it wasn't so much about generating sort of a solidarity, but weeding out who was and was not Ottoman. So when we say the diaspora, is that really the case? I mean, how central the Greek state was central in terms of passports, but you have this just, really deep engagement with the Ottomans and the Ottoman Empire all the way up to the end. So that's another area, which brings up the whole question of like, where is the Greek state in the story of Greek shipping? So, Ottoman stuff brings this up. Even going further back, one of the things I can say about shipping is that Greek shipping, as Professor Harlapis always said, has been around forever. But when I first started doing my work, it was still, I remember reading the book, The Greek Merchant Marine, and talked about how in Ydra, and it was always Ydra, Stasis, and Sara, because they were so big in the revolution. How in the 18th century, they started sort of tentatively constructing boats and sailing around the island. In fact, Greek shipping goes way back. It's everywhere, and it's in places that we wouldn't always recognize as Greek, right? So remember, there isn't a Greek state. So Venetian historians have shown that Venetian merchants in London in the 16th century, they were Greek, but they're called Venetian because they had Venetian citizenship or Venetian status, whatever you want to call it. So there's the whole relationship of there's the whole question of the relationship between the Greek state and Greek shipping. I have some things to say about cosmopolitanism. We can talk about that if people want. A couple of things that Professor Kosmatopoulos brought up that I want to say. I wish we had, at least for the pre-modern period, of course, Professor Harlapis has done this for the modern period. It's striking how we are generally missing a history of sailors in the Mediterranean. When I teach my pre-modern Mediterranean course, there's really nothing I can give people. There is some stuff on English sailors, but sort of Mediterranean sailors, no, as compared to, let's say, the Atlantic, in which there are just tons and tons of histories of Atlantic sailors and kind of the international working class that is in the Atlantic. And I'm not quite sure about the Pacific. So we are missing that. We're also missing an environmental history of the Mediterranean, not an environmental history of the Mediterranean region. We have that, okay? But that is a history of the land. Mediterranean history is still written very much as a history of when we think about what the Mediterranean is, it's very much a surface with routes that ships go across. Except for a little bit about sponge diving, we have very little about the sea itself. This compares to, say, the Atlantic, where you can read tons of stuff on, say, cod fishing and what happened to fish, the prevalence of fish over many centuries. So the environmental history of the Mediterranean Sea itself, what was the result of the digging of the Suez Canal? How did it change I don't even know the terms, but the biochemical nature of the water in the Mediterranean? We are completely lacking that. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, can I respond, or?
Sure.
Sakis? Yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right. So I will respond on the diaspora case and the seamen. When I say diaspora, I don't mean the ones in Constantinople or Smyrna or the main Ottoman Empire. I mean Odessa, Tagarok, Berdyansk, Novorossiysk, Batum, Varna, Galatz, Sulina, okay, Trieste, Marseille, Barcelona, Malta, Amsterdam, London, Calcutta, and New York, and even, 1780s, they went to Buenos Aires and Montevideo to trade. In many of these were the merchant colonies. I mean, Greeks didn't do anything different than it was the foreign merchants that dealt with the trade. But what is important here is the relation of shipping and the Greek state, and this is in the Marxist historiography of the 1970s. You had Psiroukis that brought the issue of the connection of shipping being the main artery between Greek state and the merchant colonies. Okay, and although he went in different directions, this is the core of the thing. And this is why I always talk about, and it's quite anachronistic as I do it, but even for the 18th century, about Greek-owned shipping, okay? So it means Greeks, and we're not going to talk who is Greek, but the ones that think that are Greek, under many flags, okay? But what they did was that they became a brand name in the Mediterranean Sea. We have in Malta, as you know very well, it is Greco, they write down, okay? They because they don't write Ottomano, but it is or when they go to Genova, they would have Ottomano Idrioto or Mesolongito or Kefalonito, not Veneto, okay? So it is the local dimension that is very important that is of the islands. And it is not Hydra, Spetsa, Samsara. There are another 40 islands and very important, and which do not like Enos, okay? Enos in Thrace was and Mosconesia and Aivali or Kidonias were very important maritime places. You have shipping. Shipping companies and that trade in the big ports. They take cargoes from the Black Sea or cargoes from various places in the Eastern Mediterranean. They carry it in the Western Mediterranean and in the Northern Europe. They meet in the ports. Okay, they have the same way of business, whether they are under Venice or Ionian state or afterwards the Greek state, or they are part of the Eastern Aegean and they belong to the Ottoman state, or they are Italian state, okay? But they do communicate, and so this is the beauty of studying, of studying connections and people and mobility through the sea, okay? We have a glue here is the shipping business, okay? Shipping and trading. And this is what they have done very well. And you cannot understand at all Mediterranean shipping and trading if you go and analyze by state. You miss the picture. Okay, so this is the importance of the sea as studied as a unit. So you study the important ones, the non-important ones. Okay, and it's not only in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean. Okay, and so on. Yeah, when I say diaspora, I mean beyond what was called, I think Hasiotis had called it the Orthodox East or whatever. Not, it is the ones that were in the Ottoman Empire. No, these are not diaspora. Okay, it is beyond, and also in connection. The Greek state. For the first, we have calculated, because I'm an economic historian, the money that came in the Greek economy from the 1830s to 1860s from shipping business and from shipping abroad and from the parts that were in Greece. Formed about 2/3 of the Greek καθάριστο εθνικό εισόδημα, national, yeah, of the national income, we can say, okay? So it was a very important sector of the Greek economy, and it is still not recognized, and it is still doubted because it is not produced in Greece. This is capital that it is, they get the money abroad, beyond Greece. They don't carry the products of Greece. They are third party, they are carriers of third countries, like the Dutch were, okay? And this is how they became so big, and they became specialized in that through the sea. So this is one part. The other part is we said very, you said beautifully about the Atlantic and how important, how many wonderful studies we have about the Atlantic and about the seamen, okay? We don't have many accounts or about the lives of seamen in the Mediterranean. We are starting to have quite a few, but it is difficult. We have one of the people that is very known is Marcus Rediker, who has written about the ships as crews, as cosmopolitan crews, or it is the prototype of proletariat, okay, international proletariat. It is true that the work at sea can be done by many nationalities because they have a certain jargon. You have a certain, movements to make with which you can use certain words. So it can work as a factory, as a place of production, which is the production is movement by sea, by people of many nationalities. And this is, but Rediker has all his examples from Britain. Now, Britain was a colonial power, definitely. It did not have enough people to manage handle its ships. So it recruited people from all its colonies, all from everywhere. But this is not how most of shipping in the world worked. European shipping, apart from the British one in the 18th or 19th century, continued up to the mid-20th century to be run by people from small communities. You have small villages, small towns that where the crews of ships come from. This happened in Sweden, in Norway, and definitely in Italy, in France, and certainly in Greece. I mean, crews up to 1950s, 1960s, even 1970s, despite the internationality, 60% were usually from the same village or from the same island, okay? So is this the local dimension here, okay? So it is a very interesting and different from land industry or activity, and the sea can give a lot of examples of interaction and of working together of many people with different languages and different religions and different origins, but also it is a place where people from one place, they come from one place only. So this can be beautifully studied, and we hope to do this in the Mediterranean and provide more examples. So that is and of course, very rightly, you mentioned the environment. Fishing is the other part that we hope to develop. And because the North has all these unbelievable studies on fishing, and fishing in the Mediterranean is not abundant, yes, but there is, and people lived out of it. So this is another part which the sea can provide us with more studies. And anthropologists can do a wonderful job on that as well. And this is the idea. This is why I'm here, interdisciplinarity, and find a more common ground for dialogue, and not be beautifully cocooned in our disciplines.
Thank you, Jelena. I would like to start by this point on diaspora that was brought up by both Professor Halaftis and Professor Green. And I would like to note that it's important to think how there were many diasporas before this sort of all-encompassing Greek diaspora. There was the diaspora of people from the islands of Kefalonia and others. There's the islands of Chios and many others in the Mediterranean that have their own small diasporas. So the interesting question, I guess, historically is the historical question is, when do these sort of small local diasporas become a Greek diaspora that many people conflate within the Mediterranean or the Black Sea and perhaps beyond? So that's one of the interesting questions. What is the position of and role of Greek ship owners and businessmen also in most cases or in all cases within this process? And I think that is an interesting thread that connects from the period of Ottoman rule that Molly Green mentioned all the way to the modern so-called period in the 20th and 21st century. And that has to do, based again on what Professor Halaftis has written and a few others, on the business strategies that people employed. So I think that's one interesting point, that, you know, Greeks have not sort of a timeless characteristic ability to navigate literally and metaphorically the business world of the time, within empires, within states, within faraway, unknown lands and ports in many cases. But they also seem to have an ability to build capacity to exploit the technologies of the time. And that's also quite interesting, I think, from the 19th to the 20th century. So technology, not just in a sort of scientific way simply, but also in, to use a term that global economic historians have been using for a while, of useful and reliable knowledge. So how do you do the most with what you have in a sort of consistent way that allows you not to be scientific as in a sort of Eurocentric way of experimentation and proliferation of, you know, dissemination of results, but rather of useful, what is useful and reliable to know and apply to improve the business, solve business problems, expand, and so on. Now, when it comes to the relationship between state and maritime history or state and the sea, I think that also needs to be historicized a little bit, because all the big empires, you know, the British Empire, for instance, had a huge maritime sector that it was basically built on. It was, you know, that is what explains to a large extent the expansion of the British Empire, you know, the commercial, but also the military navy. And as you both know, and perhaps many from our audience, the two were not exactly distinct for a long period of time. You know, when you look at, not just in the Mediterranean, perhaps a bit later in the Mediterranean, but when you look at the Indian Ocean or the Caribbean in the 17th century, you know, who's a pirate and a corsair and a buccaneer? And, you know, they're all, you know, could be working for the British or the Spanish Empire in that respect. And, you know, I don't want to go to the discussion about piracy in the Mediterranean. You know, you're both extremely knowledgeable about this. But I would like to know what you think in what the position is of, you know, Greek merchants in all this, you know, in the transition from piracy, let's say, to a modern commerce. And one other thing that, you know, would probably take us to the modern era and a little bit more to the discussion of this cluster, which, if I may remind us, that it is about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics. You know, I think that for a long time, not anymore perhaps, there was this perception that, you know, merchants, and especially large merchants, are kind of inherently cosmopolitan, you know, that are kind of by definition almost, you know, if you're engaging in international commerce, then for you're cosmopolitan. And that in itself is an inherently good thing. I think we've kind of moved away a little bit from that, including the work of people like Will Handley, who, talking about Alexandria, if I remember, he came up with the term vulgar cosmopolitanism, trying to, debunk the sense that, only wealthy merchants are cosmopolitan, who probably not go very far in most cases, right? They're mostly based, and especially if they're older, they're mostly based in one place. Not that lack of mobility prevents people from being cosmopolitan. I think, again, to talk about places that are more familiar to most of us, ports in the Mediterranean had these cosmopolitan spaces, whether it is a chamber of commerce, whether there are other sort of spaces of socialization as well as business where cosmopolitanism could be practiced. I think but that doesn't mean that people, again, following Will Hanley's points, there are people who are traveling around the Mediterranean, whether as merchants or sailors, could not be assumed to have a certain type of cosmopolitanism. The polyglot merchants, but also sailors, to refer to Molly Green's call for more studies of sailors. And finally, one last thing that takes us also to the relationship between the state, and particularly the Greek state, and tycoons to follow the title. I wonder whether, and I'm probably ignorant about this and whether there are any studies, but is the propensity and large sector almost of Greek tycoons to engage in philanthropic activities and charitable activities, is it a Greek thing? Is it, the fact that you have nowadays cultural foundations that have completely changed the landscape in cultural production, in research to a certain extent? Is this a Greek thing? I mean, do other countries that have a large shipping tycoon sector, can they show a similar kind of cultural production and foundation, an organization, let's say, of cultural production similar to that of Greece? And how far back does it go? I mean, is it? I know the benevolence, of people like Marius Flaginis from Corfu, who went to Venice. He was one of the founders of the Venetian, of the Greek community there. And among other things, he, if I remember right, he started a fund for young boys from Corfu to study in Venice. And I think, that's back in the 16th century. So without, drawing too many connections and losing what happened in between, is this sort of in present day Greece and the cultural production that mostly, shipping foundations, cultural foundations of ship owners have, is this sort of a characteristic of Greece, or is it sort of representative of the sector as a whole? And I hope we'll have time to get back to more discussion about cosmopolitanism.
I have to be the bad guy here. The time is a very scarce resource in the colonized Hellas. We have 10 minutes. So this is not really my decision. I would really love the discussion. So can we promise that we share 5 minutes each of our two respondents for this? I know it's brutal, but this is all we have. So yeah, please.
Okay, can I go first? And I'll be 5 minutes. I promise, no more than that.
Thanks, Molly.
Yes, so for people out there who are contemplating a PhD, I would love to see a PhD, as Professor Harlapi said, of a village at sea. I think that would be a great study. And then the question that Professor Ageka has just put forward: how do we explain the benevolence of the Greek merchant and particularly shipping class? And does it have something, going back? I mean, I have thoughts on that. I won't go into them now because time is limited. But I think those are two great questions. Cosmopolitanism has, in Ottoman studies in particular, been heavily criticized. Yes, Will Hanley is one of them. It's been heavily criticized for several reasons. First, as historians, we like to pay attention to how the people at the time, our actors, defined themselves, and no one ever defined themselves as cosmopolitanism. It wasn't a value that was held. It's something that we put on, and we think it's good. Khalid Fahmy has pointed out that epicenter of Alexandria, as it was entering into this period that people called cosmopolitanism, was also a time of brutal labor being demanded from the peasantry, from those who were not lucky enough to be in the cosmopolitan class, such as the digging of the canal that made Alexandria, that made it possible for Alexandria to grow as a port. We associate we like cosmopolitanism because we associate it with being open and tolerant. That is not necessarily at all the case. You can travel around the world and be very intolerant. And Francesca Trivelato has pointed out what she calls the term communitarian cosmopolitanism, that what allowed Livorno to flourish, a city that was remarkably tolerant of Jews, that had Eastern Orthodox, that was a famously tolerant, it's always described that way, early modern port. People did business with each other and could do business with each other and wanted to do business with each other only if they knew which community you belonged to. Okay, this was not like, oh, we're all like, moving beyond community and we're, having drinks together. That was not at all the case. That commerce was facilitated by very strict communal belonging. So that's another. When do these small diasporas become bigger? That's really, really interesting. I would like to ask Professor Harlaptis a question, and I don't know if it's fair to intrude on her 5 minutes, but I was thinking, one of the things I talk about with my students is in Mediterranean studies, there's this argument that why does the Mediterranean disappear in the 19th century? Why is it no longer a subject of study? And what they mean by that is that the Mediterranean, prior to the 19th century, the two shores were connected, west and east were connected, then the Mediterranean does become colonized in the 19th century, meaning that outside powers, particularly the British, broke those traditional ties, right? So like today, if you're in Crete, you can't take a ship, you can't get on a ship and go to Alexandria, right? So the Mediterranean disappears in the 19th century, and there's this whole discussion about how the Mediterranean cannot be modern. And yet Professor Harlaptis, and very correctly so empirically, is describing continuity when it comes to Greek shipping. So I would be fascinated, and I'm going to come to hear her thoughts on this late 18th to 19th century transition, which is so prominent, at least in writings about the Mediterranean, that somehow the Mediterranean we're all familiar with disappears at the end of the 18th century. But the Greek case sort of calls that into question. So I would love her comments on that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Green. Professor Jelena?
Yes, it is not fair, Molly. We have to talk about this. I don't understand what you mean by Mediterranean disappearing, because it was steamship companies that did passenger shipping, and the Mediterranean was very much connected all the shores in the 19th century, and Panaiti strati to the interwar period, to the mid 19th century. And Panaiti strati, as this Romanian Greek novelist, has written about all these men that were hopping from steamship to steamship illegally to go to Alexandria, take an Austrian Lloyd ship, go to Alexandria or to Napoli or to other places. So it is the airplane that disconnected the Mediterranean, okay? And that is not in the 19th century. 19th century, the Mediterranean was extremely connected. I'm sorry, I have to close that down, please. I'm sorry about this. Okay. But we'll talk about this. It's very interesting. Diaspora of big merchants, trading companies. I'm talking about huge trading companies, Raleigh Brothers, 1810 to 1962, 20,000 workers in India, right? This is a huge trading company called British Trading Company by Jeffrey Jones. But up to 1950s, all the big managers come from Chios or from Kefalonia or from Corfu. They are chosen Greek. So why is that? We have to see that. And in the 20th century, our big diaspora capitalists are the ship owners. Okay, this is what is very important. And it is not only ship owners' psyches; it is the big the tycoons. And when we're talking about tycoons, Valiano Brothers, just captains that did not speak but Greek, whether in Russia or in London or Marseille, they left with money of today's money, 2 billion 200 million euros, okay, and Onassis left about 2.5 billion euros of today's money. So it is equivalent. So we are talking about tycoons, and Valiano left a huge sort of foundation in Kefalonia that was the social security of Kefalonia. So philanthropy. These were the. It was they were called. You know very well. There were big robber barons. They were called. Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and so on. They all did huge foundations, but it's not. I mean, and in Greece, all the Dromokaitis, large merchant in Marseille, Goulandris, Tsigros, all the, of course, Niarchos and Onassis. So it is just the big money that they. I think there's a whole sort of, there's quite a lot of literature about philanthropy and the aftermath that they want to leave a legacy, okay? So I think I've covered have probably 1 minute, but I think that's enough. Oh yes, and I will finish with innovation. Greeks invented, I mean, my last book on the Valianos and Onassis indicates the various innovations, which is not, as you rightly put it, Sakis, in technology, it is also in business practices. So the model that it is used today by all shipping companies in the world was invented by Greeks mainly, and by Onassis particularly, and a group of Greeks at that time in the 1940s and 1950s, okay? These were the new men, the new tanker men, that replaced the old British shipping elite, okay, in carrying new cargoes in a new more globalized world that needed oil. So they invented. Others have made cars or lab or computers or pharmaceuticals. We're good in ships. So and dealing with the sea. And it is, and this will be my last sentence, cosmopolitanism and the islands and shipping, okay? People from Greek islands left and went to and visited 20 or 30 ports in 1 year, talked, the simple seaman would be able to communicate in 5 or 6 languages, okay? When many shipping or maritime places stopped being shipping maritime places, like Mykonos or Santorini, then all the world came to these islands, okay? Now, how we have to discuss about cosmopolitanism in another conference, Nicholas, and I'm very happy for this discussion today. Thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah, it was wonderful to be able to talk about these big ideas with the two of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, yeah, for me too. And thank you, Nicholas, and the team of Decolonize HELLAS.
Thank you, Sakis. And thank you all. Thank you, Professor Green, Molly from Princeton. Thank you, Jelena, Professor Harlafis from Crete, and Sakis, Professor Gekas from York. This, as we said at the beginning, was only an effort to scratch the surface of this vast topic, but I think we did it as best as we could with the best people in the field. We have many open questions out there. You know, if decolonizing and colonialism in general fits in as a category, does it add as a question to understand better Greek shipping or not? These are only very preliminary questions that we hope to take up again in the next iteration. But for now, unfortunately, we have to stop here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for participating, and hoping that this will open the appetite for another bigger panel and a longer panel on cosmopolitanism at sea, diasporas, and philanthropy, and many other topics that are still to be discovered. Thank you so much, and have a good continuation, because we continue with another panel today, and a great keynote speech at 9 with Professor Mamdani from Columbia University. Thanks.